When you listen to today's housing debate, what feels most disconnected from the actual causes of high prices and low affordability?
I have a motto that data yields information, information yields knowledge, knowledge yields action or policy. The immovable object is basically land use restrictions that are imposed by 33,000 individual zoning jurisdictions in the United States. 33,000. We've done 30 case studies around the country. And what we have found is builders do not build expensive housing because they want to. They build it because it's the only thing that's legal. And it really comes back to those 33,000 jurisdictions. They set the price of housing. They determine what gets built, and they determine what doesn't get built.
Welcome back to Keys to Real Estate. I'm your host, Mary Schuster. Well, if you work anywhere in housing, you've probably had this moment where you hear another well-meaning official talk about solving the affordability crisis with lower rates, subsidies, or down payment assistance. And you can feel your shoulders start to tense because you know that more demand without supply doesn't make housing more affordable. In fact, it makes it more expensive. Well, my guest today has spent his career proving that truth with data, not anecdotes. Ed Pinto is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's the co-director of AEI's Housing Center. He's also one of the most clear-eyed voices in housing policy today. So in this conversation, we dig into why housing breaks people's brains, why builders aren't the villains they're often made out to be, and how 33,000 local zoning jurisdictions quietly shaped what gets built and what never does. So if you've ever wondered why starter homes are disappearing, why the demand-side solutions keep dominating our political talking points, or why the math never seems to quite math, this episode will definitely help connect the dots. So let's get right to it with AEI's Ed Pinto. The presenting sponsor for this season of Keys to Real Estate is First American Trust. First American Trust redefines banking for title and escrow companies. They offer innovative solutions that integrate banking functions directly into title and escrow software systems, enhancing operational efficiency and safeguarding financial transactions. At First American Trust, you have direct access to a personal relationship manager who delivers answers in real time. First American Trust is also recognized as an elite provider for the American Land Title Association. As a wholly owned subsidiary of First American Financial Corporation, they have roots in real estate tracing back over 135 years and is the only bank owned by a title company. With deep roots, advanced solutions, and a commitment to real relationships, they are setting a new standard for the industry. The future of banking for title and escrow starts with First American Trust. Visit firstamtrust.com to learn more. Ed Pinto, welcome to Keys to Real Estate. We're so happy to have you with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mary.
Well, I want to get right to it because you have spent a career studying housing through the lens of data rather than mere politics, and then you take that data and you use it to inform policymakers. So when you listen to today's housing debate, what feels most disconnected from the actual causes of high prices and low affordability?
Well, again, as you said, my career has been in housing and data, and I have a motto that data yields information, information yields knowledge, knowledge yields action or policy. And so everything we do is based on that sequence and trying to figure out what policies actually work, which ones don't work, and of the ones that work, which ones will move the needle. And the way I describe our current dysfunctional situation with housing and housing affordability is the immovable object against irresistible force. And the immovable object is basically land use restrictions that are imposed by 33,000 individual zoning jurisdictions in the United States. 33,000. Their goal, exercised individually, because they individually make their own decisions, unless they're superseded by state governments. I'll come back to that in a minute. Their goal is to stop housing, to make housing expensive. They won't admit that. But ultimately to make land expensive by making it scarce and not being used to its highest and best use. That's the immovable object spread among 33,000 jurisdictions. The irresistible force is the federal government, which basically says, oh, we want to do something, But first of all, they're constrained by the Constitution, which says, well, land use is the part of the function of the states. The federal government is a government of defined rights or abilities, and everything else under the 10th Amendment redounds to the states. And so since land use isn't mentioned as a responsibility of the federal government, the states get it under the 10th Amendment, which they then distribute to the 33,000 local jurisdictions. And so what the federal government can do is move the demand needle. Well, they're very good at that. Oh, we're going to lower interest rates. We're going to change underwriting to make it easier. Oh, we're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to provide this subsidy. All of that is on the demand side, and it's very easy to move the demand needle. The supply needle moves very slowly because you ultimately have to be able to build it, and it takes time to build, and then you have these 33,000 jurisdictions that don't want things built in general. What they like to see built, for example, is, oh yeah, you want to build a self-storage facility? Yeah, that will approve. There are no people living there. There are no children going to school. It's just pure revenue. Well, we like pure revenue, and therefore we'll approve every one of that. So when you drive down the highway, you'll see them all over the place. They're being built everywhere. They are easy to build. You go to a city, yeah, you've got it. You want to build housing? No, wait, let's ask you death by 1,000 cuts. So that's the problem. The federal government's very good at demand, and the localities are very good at constraining supply. And so you end up getting a mismatch between supply and demand, which leads to higher prices, but you also get a mismatch between the type of housing. Because the other thing that these 33,000 localities don't want is they don't want starter homes. Starter homes are on smaller lots. Oh, we don't want smaller lots. Starter homes are smaller lots, lead to smaller homes themselves. Oh yeah, well, we don't like small lots. And they particularly don't like townhomes, which are the ultimate in starter home is a townhome. It's on less land, it's a smaller home, but still family sized, and it costs a lot less to build than an equivalent size single family detached house. But most places don't allow townhomes or they severely restrict them. So that's the landscape that we live in.
It is. And it's, well, two things I'd like to double click on there. One, that's part of the problem that some of the younger first time buyers, I think, express their frustration without really understanding that starter homes are more restricted for new building than are others. And so they're very frustrated with trying to get a toehold, and with the existing inventory, which has scaled larger and larger and larger, they're just locked out of that for obvious reasons because people tend to graduate up. But also the larger supply and demand, I'd like to talk about a little bit more because it is a core frustration for many of our audience because, again, they keep hearing solutions offered for affordability, down payment assistance and tax credits and subsidies, and they get so frustrated knowing that those aren't going to alleviate price or create more supply. And it's just the solutions prescribed from so many, at least that are holding federal office or vying for it, just seems so counterintuitive that that frustration level really tends to set in.
And I call it not demand stupid, it's supply stupid. Jerusalem Demsis, who's a writer for the Atlantic Monthly, wrote a great article a few years ago called Housing Breaks People's Brains. That's the title of it. And she basically goes through and says, look, you do a survey and you say, what happens if you build more cars? The price of cars goes down. What happens if you build more computers? The price of computers goes down. More cell phones, more this, more that, more clothing, whatever, the price goes down. You build more housing, the price goes up. Wait a minute, what happened to Economics 101? And she says that she's identified two reasons why housing breaks people's brains. And I have a friend of mine who has a great expression, which is the plural of anecdote is anecdotes, not data.
Correct.
You can tell me 1,000 anecdotes and it's still not data. We have to go by data. So back to Jerusalem Demsis. She says you've got demand denialism and supply skepticism. Denialism is, well, we don't need any more supply. We have plenty of supply for demand because I drive around and there's lots under construction, so there must be plenty of housing. Well, the only thing that seems to work with is back to my example of the self-storage facilities. There are lots of those, but when it comes to housing, not so much in most places. And then you have this supply skepticism, which gets to something you just said, Mary, which is, wait a minute, if you build more supply, the builders are just going to rape and pillage. They're just going to build expensive housing. Well, the point, we've done 30 case studies around the country. And what we have found is builders do not build expensive housing because they want to. They build it because it's the only thing that's legal. land is valued at its highest and best use that's legal. If you require a quarter acre lot, then that's all you can do is build on a quarter acre lot or more. And if you build on a quarter acre lot, there's a formula, a very simple formula builders use, rule of thumb, which says if you're talking about new lots that are, in greenfield areas, you're really talking about a 4-to-1 ratio. For every dollar of lot, you're going to build about $4 of value. Well, if you have a lot that's a quarter acre that sells for $100,000, you have to build a house that sells for, including the land, $500,000. So the land share ends up being about 20%. On the other hand, if you can go with an eighth acre lot, and that lot costs, instead of, I'm just going to make it simple, instead of $100,000, sells for $50,000, then you can build a $250,000 house on that, under the same rule of thumb. Now, the $250,000 house is going to be maybe 1,800 square feet, and the house built on the quarter acre lot might be 2,500 square feet, and the 2,500 square foot lot's going to be more quartz granite tops and whatever, and maybe some more bathrooms and this and that. And the smaller lot one's going to have less appointments, but it's going to cost a lot less. And so we've looked at the entire country, and we have found that builders indeed are building to what's legal. And it really comes back to those 33,000 jurisdictions. They set the price of housing. They determine what gets built, and they determine what doesn't get built in the United States. It's not the builders. The builders are building to what's legal.
Do you think the folks working in that sphere of the 33,000 understand the results that come from those decisions, or do they kind of look at them in a box of just, well, we're trying to solve these problems and not realizing the whole rest of the gamut that becomes clogged because of those decisions?
I think they're in their own sort of little bubble. And again, go back to the example of the storage units. They have two different developments come before them. One is for storage units. Oh, we're going to get, I don't know what a storage unit costs. Let's say it's $1 million, and it's going to pay $30,000 in property taxes every year. Oh, we get net, gross 30, net 30. We have no expenses, basically, for that. Now somebody comes by and they say they want to build 5 houses at $200,000 a piece. Wait a minute, how many children are we going to have? How many, what's this? What's that? We got to, this, that. Boy, yes, they're going to pay this much in property taxes, but boy, we're going to have all these expenses. We don't want no stinking 5 houses on, $200,000. We'd rather have $1 million house. Because if we have $1 million house, well, how many children are going to have? Maybe 0. And they're not going to require this or that because there's only one house. They don't require much garbage collection, yada, yada. And so that's the arithmetic they go through. Of course, if you follow that, the whole reason for having cities and towns and counties becomes questionable. Isn't the whole purpose is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Instead, it's become life, liberty, and the pursuit of property value. We're going to preserve the property values. We're going to keep them going up. How are we going to do that? We're going to make housing scarce. They don't really think that's what they're doing, but that is what they're doing, making housing scarce, which then makes it expensive. And they double down on that by saying, not only are we going to make the housing scarce, we're going to make it basically illegal to build starter homes, which is why the average sized house in the United States that was getting built in the 50s was 12 or 1,300 square feet. And then it went to 15, 18, 2,000, eventually topped out, I forget exactly, 2,500 square feet. It's crept down to 2,300 square feet. Again, not because builders didn't want to build smaller houses, but because it just became slightly easier to build smaller houses in new residential subdivisions, largely in the South and Southwest, which is where most new housing gets built.
Yes, and we're starting to get some conversations as we move into the 2026 election cycle, and certainly it's going to be a big issue, the 2028 election cycle, and what should voters be listening for? But more for this conversation, what should people who work in the industry be listening for if they want to distinguish and support candidates that are talking about policies that would actually be helpful? And I think we've zeroed in on where they'll find that versus things that sound good, things that sound appealing, and actually instead just exacerbate the problem.
So I'm just pulling up a quote here. This was Binya Applebaum, who's an editorial board member at the New York Times. The way to make housing more affordable is to build more housing. Number 1. A litmus test you can use anytime politicians say they have an idea to make housing more affordable. Will it result in more housing construction? Now, So when you look at the ideas that are being bandied about, whether you're a voter or a renter or a homeowner or you're in the industry, is A, are they just talking about increasing demand? So if you're going to go to a 50-year mortgage, if you're going to allow people to take money out of their savings, their retirement savings, you're going to provide this subsidy or that, you're going to lower interest rates by 50 basis points, 100 basis points, that just increases demand. It hasn't added one house. So when you do that, that demand, given Economics 101 against a relatively fixed supply, only one thing can happen, and that's prices go up. And that goes up through a process we call capitalization. Credit easing, whatever it is, lower rates, less restrictive underwriting rules, whatever that effect is, it creates more jingle in the buyer's pocket, gets converted into higher prices through a capitalization into the price, which really comes back to a increase in land value because the structure value didn't get changed when this happens. It's only the land value that gets changed, which goes back to 3,000 jurisdictions. So if it's only increasing demand, then by definition, it's not going to do anything for supply. Therefore, it's not going to move the needle. So then you get into the supply issues, supply solutions. And the question there is, will it actually move the needle? So lots of times they'll talk about low-income housing tax credit, which in the One Big Beautiful Bill, they increased it by something like 15% or something. Well, there's lots of research that shows for every low-income housing tax credit unit that gets built, one market rate unit doesn't get built. So the actual net addition to supply is zero. So you've spent a lot of money, but it actually hasn't increased supply. So that's one approach. I started my career in subsidized housing at the Michigan State Housing Development Authority as an attorney and then general counsel there. So I've been involved in this for a very long time. My conclusion is that housing subsidies are of no value. They just are shuffling the deck chairs around on a Titanic that's really being driven back by these 33,000 jurisdictions. We'll come to the solution in a moment. So subsidized housing isn't the solution. Things like inclusionary zoning, which is very popular, which says, oh, if you build some housing and you dedicate some of it to lower income, that just raises the price of the other side of the equation, the market rate side. And again, it's a zero-sum game. And a lot of housing doesn't get built. We did a study in Seattle that before they put in inclusionary zoning that required certain income limits on a certain percentage, they were building housing to beat the band because they went with smaller lots in certain areas starting in 1998 in Seattle. They were building thousands and thousands and thousands of homes. Once they put in that requirement for the income limits on a certain percentage, 75% of the business disappeared. 75%. And so if it doesn't actually lead to more housing, it's not going to work. So I could go on all day about all the things that don't work because that's the last 75 years of federal policy has largely been about things that don't work. Because if they'd worked, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Well, and you mentioned, like so wisely mentioned, that the 10th Amendment problem or feature, depending on how you want to look at it. And I think another reason we tend to get these same ineffective prescriptions over and over that, again, increase the problem instead of making any net new real availability is talking about the demand side of the equation gets votes.
And it's easy.
And it's easy.
The federal government, it's easy.
Yes.
And it's immediate.
It is immediate. And I think we've noticed the current administration starting to grapple with this. Even the president himself tends to talk about demand-based issues. And just fairly recently, he's kind of pivoted a little bit and said, well, wait a minute. We need to keep the values high because that's where most people accumulate or begin to accumulate net worth. And so I'm hearing some at least starting to grapple with the supply-demand equation. Not a lot of prescriptions yet, but I think they're getting ready to focus on some housing policy. So any thoughts on that?
So let me give you a peek at the prescriptions we've suggested. You need a mix of things that will have an immediate impact, which is hard to do with new construction because by definition it takes time. But you can repurpose and use existing stock in different ways, and I'll come back to that. And the second is longer term, how do you get more new construction, in particular, more starter homes? And I'll come back to that. So on the first point, and the way I think about this, I testified in January before the subcommittee of the House Oversight Committee. And in preparing for that testimony, I started organizing my thoughts into a common theme, which was constraints on capital. So you have the capital gains tax, which is a huge constraint on capital use. It tends to freeze capital. And we have the example of if you own a home and you sell it, you get a $250,000 or $250,000 or $500,000 exemption, depending on whether single or joint taxpayer. That dollar amount hasn't changed since 1997 when it was passed. Just indexing for inflation would double it to 500 and a million. And if you indexed it for house prices, it would basically go almost to 1 million and 2 million. And so that has frozen a huge number of people in place who don't want to pay the damn capital gains tax,
Whether they need the square foot or not.
whether they need it or not. So they're sitting there with a lot of empty space, but they don't want to pay the tax. And that creates huge inefficiencies in the use of capital. That capital can't redistribute itself to people who can use it better. And we're not talking about forcing people out of their home. It's just saying take away the impediment to them making that decision, an impediment. So that's one thing that could be done. We estimate that would free up about 200,000 family-sized homes that are sitting there today that are owned by people over age 65 a year. That's a significant reshuffling of the chairs so that the right people are in the right homes, done by the market.
Yes.
So people that are empty nesters or even one person moves to something smaller, which we know they do if they have the opportunity. And then people who have families move into the family-sized houses, and then they free up houses through the filtering down process. So that's one idea. That would have an immediate impact, meaning some people would decide, once that were passed, they decide tomorrow to sell. And then some would decide 5 years from now, but over time, we're talking a lot of people and a lot of reshuffling. Secondly, there are 32 million vacant rooms, part of it caused by this freezing that I just described, where you have empty nesters in 3 and 4 bedroom houses with a lot of vacant bedrooms. The Realtor.com did a very thorough study a year ago on this. I've reviewed it in depth, and I think it's well done. And I think the 32 million number is certainly in the ballpark in single family homes. So there are a lot of impediments to renting those out. People may just not want to rent. That's fine. But 32 million homes is a lot of homes. What if you were to say, going forward, if you haven't rented a room in the past and you start renting it, there's no income tax on that room rent. How much revenue is the federal government getting today on the 32 million vacant rooms? Zero. So they're not giving up a penny. Well, is it feasible that over 10 years, maybe 10% of those 32 million rooms might get rented? I think that's a reasonable number. Well, 3.2 million rented rooms is 320,000 a year. Well, that's a lot of rooms, and they'd be renting at relatively low rates. People would be getting supplemental income, which would help pay for rising property taxes and insurance and you name it, and help with their just income. And therefore, and those rooms exist. So again, that would have an immediate, slow but immediate impact on supply. It actually moves the needle. The third idea actually gets at the longer term supply, and that is how do you cut the Gordian knot of the 33,000 jurisdictions, all of whom get their authority from the states. Think about it. The United States Constitution does not mention municipalities. There's no mention of municipalities in the Constitution.
It's the state.
They are creatures of the state. They get all of their authority from the state, individual states, and they get their zoning authority delegated from the individual states who get that under the Constitution from the 10th Amendment. And so that's where it starts. And so that's where I'd like to see the solution. And so there are 50 states. Right now, there are about 15 states that have active legislation going on in various legislatures that would deal with smaller lots, starter homes, EDUs, potential construction in commercial areas, etc. I'll be putting out a piece on this shortly, and where we pulled together all of these states. This can work. Texas just passed a bill last year, 2024, Senate Bill 15, that sets a maximum minimum lot size of 3,000 square feet on 19 large cities in the state of Texas. And that basically says you can't have your 5, 6, 7, 10,000 square foot minimum lot sizes. And so that's a very important way to unfreeze the market. And so we're seeing that being talked about in state after state. So now we get to the federal government. What could the federal government do to promote something like that? You asked the question about the 10th Amendment. Is that a feature or a bug? Well, the problem with the federal government is one of the problems, besides that they can demand things very easily and have a hard time on supply. They believe in one size fits all, which is the way you get things through Congress. Right. And so back to LIHTC. LIHTC is distributed per capita based on population. So the largest states get the most money. They have a hold harmless for very small states, but there's only a few of those. So by and large, the money is distributed based on a per capita basis. Doesn't have anything to do with who needs it, are they doing things that are actively making house prices go out of sight? Hint, hint, California. Yet California gets more money than any other state for LIHTC, which, by the way, that money doesn't go as far because it's very expensive to build in California and the rents are very high. So the federal government has to spend a lot of money to build anything in California, which California is actively making it expensive to do that. And so we have a disconnect in how all of this works. And so the federal government is very bad at coming up with these things. But it does have ways of providing incentives. And so I've come up with an idea, I call it the bounty idea, which I learned. I have 4 grandchildren, age 6, 5, 4, and 2, wonderful ages. And with 3 of them aged 6, 4, and 2, we'll go out to dinner as a family with my son and his wife and my wife. And so there'll be, 7 of us around the table. And at some point, the grandchildren get pretty antsy. And so the granddad, that me, says, let's go for ice cream. And they get all excited. And the mother says, Granddad's in charge. And they go merrily prancing down the street a block and a half away to the ice cream place, singing, Granddad's in charge, Granddad's in charge. We get to the ice cream place, and they are the most well-behaved children you can ever imagine. 45 minutes later, the other 3 adults show up, and they are amazed at how the children, who are very antsy at the dinner table, are so well-behaved eating their ice cream. So bribery works.
Incentive structures matter.
Yes, and so we need to have positive reinforcement and some incentives for the states. So I've come up with a bounty program that says, look at states, here's how many small lots you've in effect authorized through new small lots that get built on through new subdivisions, through lot splits, whatever. To the extent that you increase that number of homes that get built on small lots and sold, we'll give you $25,000 to the state. We don't need to provide an incentive to the home builders. They'd love to build on smaller lots. I already mentioned that. Right. They just need the cities and states to get out of the way. And so we'll give you $25,000 for every additional small lot that gets built on and sold. By the way, if you do this small lot in an area that has one of these reshoring factories or new manufacturing factory that's getting built, that the federal government is pushing, pharmaceutical factories, all these factories, we'll give you a second bounty of $25,000 if it's within 10 miles of one of those, because we want to reinforce doing the right thing. And then third, if it's in an area that has potential for tear down and replacement, you can tear down, instead of building McMansion, which generally gets built in high land value places today, if you could build 4 townhomes or 3 single family homes on that lot, detached homes on that lot instead, with smaller lots, we'll give you $25,000 for that. Fourth, and I know you mentioned this before we started, if it's Bureau of Land Management land and that's sold for residential use, to a private developer, and they use it for small lots, starter homes, then they'll get $25,000. I basically said, look, you can't get more than 2 bounties per lot, and that ends up being about $37,000 per bounty, perhaps. Well, 200,000 homes a year, additional starter homes a year, could get built with this, and it would cost about $7-9 billion, which in the scheme of what the federal government spends on subsidized housing, which is around $100 billion, is a relative drop in the bucket. But instead of having ineffective programs, we know this would move the needle. And I'll just finish by saying, what's a small lot? Well, we looked at the size of lots. For single-family detached, the 90th percentile in lot size is below 5,000 square feet. So we'll call a starter home small lot for single-family detached below 5,000 square feet. For a single family attached or townhome, the median is 2,000 square feet. We would set that for the townhome, because the other thing is we want more townhomes, which again, it's illegal in most places to build townhomes. And so we want to promote the building of townhomes, because those are really, along with small lot, single family detached, are the ultimate new construction starter home. And then that sets off two things. One is a virtuous cycle, because once they pass these things, which we're not saying what to do, we're going to measure the outcome. And I learned that from studying Houston, which back in 2013, the mayor of Houston looks around and says, our homeless rate is too high. Now, most cities would give their eye teeth for the homeless rate Houston had in 2013, but the mayor thought it was too high. And he said, we're not doing this very effectively in dealing with homelessness. We need to drive the number down. We need to do two things. One is we need to get the entire Houston metro on board, not just the city. So he called together all of the other mayors and county officials, et cetera, and all the nonprofits, and got them together as a council. And then he said, second thing, we need to measure the right outcome, data. Measuring how many room nights we provided in shelters only leads us to build more shelters. If you ask somebody on the street, what do you want? They want a home. They're never going to say, I want a shelter. And therefore, what we want to measure is how many people did we take off the street and put into housing in their own name that 2 years later, they still were there. That goes under the name rapid rehousing in the industry. You want to get people back into housing, and the faster you can do that, the longer they stay on the street, the worse things happen. Nothing good happens living on the street. But if you're on the street 2 weeks and you can get somebody back rapidly into housing, that's a lot easier to do than having them there 2 years. Same thing within a shelter. And so they did this. They also have, back to the small lots, Houston in 1998 shrank the minimum lot size from 5,400 to 1,400 square feet in an 80 square mile area around downtown, surrounded by, I think it's the 610 Beltway. They then expanded that to the entire city in 2013. It has led to tens and tens and tens of thousands of homes being built in Houston. People say, oh, the reason Houston has affordable housing is because it doesn't have zoning. Well, it didn't have zoning, but it did have land use restrictions like minimum lot size, which is a key factor, as I've said, in constraining starter homes. I say, well, it grows through just expansion and people moving further and further out. But when we have all these maps that show, no, there's been tens and tens and tens of thousands of housing units built in the city limits of Houston, most of them within 10 miles of downtown Houston, the core of downtown Houston. You look at a similar map for Los Angeles and nothing's been built in the last 75 years. Whereas Houston has got huge amounts that have been built. They still have a lot of older housing, but they have huge amounts of new housing. So that's how Houston, through a combination of their housing policy, which is basically get out of the way, and secondly, saying let's focus on what counts, which is putting people back into housing and having them stay there for a couple of years. Houston now has the lowest homeless rate per capita in the country of any large city. It is 1/17th the homeless rate of the Los Angeles area. So Los Angeles, which spends billions and billions and billions on, quote, affordable housing and homelessness, has 17 times per capita the homeless rate of Houston. And Houston doesn't have the money to spend on all that subsidy stuff. They just let the market do it through smaller lots, and then they end up with a very low homeless rate.
You can't argue with results.
Can't argue with results. You got to focus on results.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know about you, but what I really appreciate about Ed's perspective is how relentlessly grounded it is in outcomes. Not intentions, not talking points, but results. In this first part of our conversation, we looked at how we got here and how decades of demand-based policy collided with deeply restrictive land use rules, and why that collision keeps prices high and choices limited. It's not a comfortable diagnosis, but it is an honest one. So you'll want to be sure and catch our next episode when we'll shift from the diagnosis to solutions. We'll talk about what actually moves the needle, why state-level action matters much more than most people realize, and what industry professionals should be listening for as housing becomes a central issue in the 2026 and 2028 election cycles. You don't want to miss it. And so until next time, I'm Mary Schuster for October Research, where knowledge is the competitive advantage.